We got a call. We got an interesting question one day that came out of the blue where a company that we'd worked with, we had trained them in our whole program. They'd gone through the Enneagram training. They'd gone through our uh, communication, intent versus impact, which I think triggered some of what we're talking about here,
Mhm.
productive conflict. And it's funny, when we go through these trainings, it often reveals something that's already there when we train a team. And we got contacted because what we had apparently revealed was that there was some victim mentality going on within this team, and it was negatively impacting their productivity, the team culture. And so they ask us, they're like, do you have questions where you could reveal victim mentality?
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit more about what does that mean here in a little bit, but it sparked us in this thinking about how do you reveal that. We've done trainings before. We've explained that often when uh, a sign of low emotional health is people are only framing themselves within the hero or victim kind of language. They're either the
Yeah.
savior or I was powerless. And so they are putting themselves in these different frames. And so it got us to thinking about it. And as we've been thinking about this wisdom series we were talking about how we interpret our story, how we tell our story. And so we started talking about this framework of the hero, the victim, and the villain, which is how we interpret and tell our story. And there's this piece about the guide or the mentor, which we'll get to later. And this shows up in, lots of storytelling. People may even have some familiarity to it, but I think we have some fresh stuff to bring to this.
Yeah, and we're
And
primarily focusing on only those that you just mentioned. We're
yeah,
not looking today at the many other, yeah, Jungian
yeah,
archetypes. So, yeah,
right.
just to note that.
Right, because we're talking about our own story, how we interpret our own story, how we
Yeah.
see our own story. And I think I shared this with you recently where I used to have this experience where we would go on these long drives, like a group of people were going somewhere on a long drive together. And a lot of times when we get in the car, I would turn to someone at the beginning of a 6-hour drive or turn to the whole car and say, we got lots of time. Tell me the story of your life. And people would laugh and they'd, do this thing. And I'd be like, no, seriously, we have a lot of time. Like, I'd love to hear your story. And I did that for years and I got so many different people's stories. And you hear how people frame their stories and how they tell
Yeah.
their stories. But what I was noticing as I became more aware of this framework was how I was telling my own. And how when I was in a group of people where people were telling good stories or stories of opportunity, stories of positive experiences, I told my story from the hero framework. I
So side note,
Yeah,
people feel your story and they feel the energy and it affects how they then
yes,
respond,
how
right?
they tell their own story. Right.
Yeah, because if you've got too much of that intense, like the hero kind of thing, then somebody who may not be feeling very heroic can like, ooh,
Mhm.
and then if someone's too victimy or they're blaming everything, then you suddenly feel like you're carrying some of that on yourself or
Mhm.
you're getting frustrated with with
Yeah.
them playing the victim. There's all sorts of reactions. But I think I'm really excited about this conversation and hearing what your thoughts are on this because I think there's a way that we can communicate our story. You're absolutely right,
Right.
where it leaves the other person going, I feel drawn in, but not
Right.
pushed in any direction. It's opening up my own space of vulnerability, honesty, but without putting all that stuff on anybody that I'm maybe responsible for. And we'll get into that whole piece of
Yeah.
it.
Well, because that was the switch that I realized that really bothered me, which made me start thinking about this a lot more, was I realized when people had a really hard story and several people told a hard story, I would shift and I would focus on the harder parts of my story. But
Oh, yeah, right. Sure.
and I don't think I was doing it consciously, but it was unconscious. But later I started to realize that I was doing that.
Hmm.
And the real stories are when we admit that we are all three, that We are at times we show up as the hero,
Yeah,
at
yeah,
times we
yeah.
show up as the villain, and sometimes we are the victim, sometimes we are the villain. And I want to make a little distinguish about this because when we're talking about this term victim and victim mentality, we aren't talking about like actual victim, where what we mean by that is someone who has zero control over their life. They actually do not have any say because they are
A
um,
child.
a child
Yeah,
enslaved in
yeah.
a there's situations throughout human
Real.
history,
Yes.
yes, where they do not have any say over their lives. Most of us are not in that, so that's the kind of situation we're talking about. I think that
But even then, even Viktor Frankl in
yeah.
his books Man's Search for Meaning
Mm.
still says, even then, right? There's like a you can have my body, but you can't have my soul kind of thing.
Yeah, there's the story about like a bread or cheese, or you told me the
Yeah.
story recently. What was
Yeah,
that?
yep. Yep. He would watch as individuals would usually scramble for anything if they found it. They'd eat it immediately. And then every once in a while there was somebody who would pick it up and go,
Mm.
and that was a way of preserving their humanity. Like
You're saying they'd
refusing
pick
to
it up and
become
they'd share.
they'd break off a piece. Even a tiny, tiny, tiny piece, they'd break it off. And he said, and that was the sort of like, I'm keeping my humanity in the middle of this, and it's a shared humanity and it's a shared experience, and they were the ones that managed to keep their soul. And I think he's the one who also says at some point it was like a way of saying, it was a defiance, not in sort of like you're the villain and I hate you kind of defiance, but more like you can have my body but I have my soul. I've got that part.
Mm.
And I think that to me inspires the hell out of me. Like that is one of my north stars. I want to aim my life more in that direction of like less of that like I'm a subject to something, and we'll talk about that in the victim stuff when we get to that. But
Mm.
that is, yeah. But back to your point, you're absolutely right. There are real victims,
Yeah.
and all of us have been victimized by something. So we're not saying victim archetype is a bad thing, and
Right.
yeah, so we're not saying that at all. Or the hero is the good thing. We're actually
Right.
looking at the sides of all of that in which it can become really ossified and become sort of an extreme version of itself, in which then it becomes ugly, regardless of what it is.
Yeah, this is why we're talking about these as archetypes, which means they are in all of us. There are times where we are all of these things, probably all in the same day at times, in different situations, in different contexts. But the beginning, I want to talk about just it's not the story, it's the interpretation of the story.
Mm-hmm.
That's where it really comes down to. Like we have to start by remembering that it's our interpretation of our experience, not just the experience.
Yep.
The interpretation and response to a circumstance holds more power than the circumstance itself. Like you were
Mm-hmm.
just saying with the Viktor Frankl. So we aren't always aware of this. We will sometimes automatically take on these roles as we go through the cycle, which we'll even talk about later, without knowing it. But as the brilliant Joel Hubbard says, it's once you can see yourself being yourself that you can finally change.
Well, it's brilliant because I stole it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, yeah. I have to
Dude, I
admit
was going to
that
give
I
you credit.
stole it.
I gave you credit for it.
I know. I appreciate it, but
Nothing's original, right?
the integrity in me goes, don't take credit for that. So
Yeah.
I have to do that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So the interpretation. Any thoughts about how we interpret our
Well,
story?
I think that is such the insight there in terms of wisdom. So we're in this wisdom series, and that is one of the ways we wisely respond to stories is by recognizing our interpretation. We can't help it. We will always have an interpretation. But when we recognize it, that's when we can see through the lens of the archetypes. Geez, I might be tipping that one a little bit heavy on the victim, or I might be tipping that one a little bit heavy on the hero. I literally had this in typing yesterday with a new client in an organization you and I are working with. And he said, I don't want to be a martyr. Like, I didn't even bring that word up at all. It wasn't even, it was a typing interview. I'm asking questions, and it was like, I don't want to be the martyr. And I immediately knew, like, he's fighting that right now because he sees that in himself as a response. And I could feel that. And it gave me so much compassion for him that I was able to tenderly approach that, and he felt seen. He was like, yeah, it's dead on. That is exactly where I'm at right now. But it was like, yeah, you swung from the hero right down to playing the martyr as the hero in the situation, but now you're kind of the victim. And that's the swing that some of us go through on any given, like you said, on any given day, any given experience. We can go from one to the next. But I think it's the wisdom is the awareness of how we're telling our stories. You know, what is the interpretation we're making of all of these experiences we've had?
Mm. Yeah, because we want to be the hero of our own story, but I think there's good things about the desire to be the hero. But the thing is about the hero in every story and why we gravitate towards stories is because the true hero is someone who is transformed by the process that they go through, which means that they are going to experience being all of these things
Yeah.
through it. But if I'm going to just briefly sum up like that, the heart or what a hero that is, there's someone who wants to save the day, right? They want to overcome struggle. They want to overcome the odds to win. They're motivated maybe to protect others from being hurt the way they were. That's something that shows up in a lot
Yeah,
of heroes.
sure.
But it's the part of us that wants to go, I want to help. I want to save the day. I want to do the good thing. I want to rise above the situation. Like that's a good
Yeah,
design.
it is, because that's agency, right? And so we see more agency in the hero than we do, say, in the victim, right? Um, so I do think there's something really wonderful. The hero is that figure that believes that you can achieve things, believes you can overcome your obstacles. And I think those of you who are into the Enneagram and you understand types pretty well, you can start to spot where the hero shows up for each of the types. And the places where we demonstrate lots of agency. And by the way, this is for all 9 types. I've watched this happen. It's like, wow, you really have a lot of confidence in this space. Like, I'm surprised by that. And then in other areas of your life, no confidence whatsoever.
Could you walk through some of that, like as it's come into your mind, to kind of simplify it
Sure.
for people?
Yeah. I think you notice, like, with type 2s, they have this optimism towards people. And it's like a real strong, confident, we can do this. There is no relational obstacle we cannot conquer if we put our hearts and our heads toward it. That's inspiring to me, because I've watched type 2s just, indomitable in their energy towards people. They demonstrate a lot of agency. Whereas other people are like, forget it, give up on that. Really, like, that relationship's never going to work. No, and they dismiss people too quickly sometimes. Now, of course, 2s have the opposite problem at times, not bringing in boundaries and moving away from relationships. But let's look at the positive for now. Let's look at the archetype is definitely there in terms of, like, the hero showing up in the space of relationship. So I see that. I think another one that comes to mind is the 6's willingness to look at potential problems, whereas other types are just like, let's just move on. Let's get past that. And that ability to look more carefully at the potential threats and problems. They manifest courage all the time because they're confronting things that are difficult while being scared. But they demonstrate that level of agency of, like, you can do this too. And they'll call other people to. Taking a look at the 9, the irony, maybe it's a paradox, is the 9 looks like they are unaffected by things around them while being greatly affected by a lot of things around them. But they have also a belief that we can live in peace and in harmony. And it drives them nuts when people cannot see that and cannot move towards that. And when a 9 engages in that, They demonstrate a lot of hero energy by being able to do that. And I've had nines do this for me, so I know this from a personal experience, not just from a theoretical perspective. I remember when my mom passed, and it was a nine, a good buddy of mine. I'm still friends with him to this day, but sat with me in the darkness and did not move and demonstrated the ability to create space and hold space. That's the ability to be the hero without having to be the sort of like, cape kind of, cape wearing kind of hero, but a more subtle one. That's why it's an archetype rather than a stereotype, right, Jim? It's like, well, to those who've experienced the nine doing that for you, that's a heroic kind of experience where they came in, created space for you so you could process your own pain and come through it to a place of peace. And I've said when nines are at their best, they're moving into that darkness of chaos, and they can go breathe and bring peace. They can take that messy, chaotic energy and bring that stillness. So, yeah,
Yeah, it's
that's what
the heroic heart is the willingness to show up, whether it's the bedside or the battle. It's the willingness to show
I
up,
like that.
right? You can just
Yeah.
uh, whatever you're great at, whether it's doing the right thing, whether it's showing up to believing in people or overcoming some obstacle or willing to go into the depths with someone or willing to sit there and figure it out and connect the dots.
Yeah.
These are all ways that people can show up. And showing up doesn't have to look in one way. It's going to show up to your story. Again, we're talking about archetypes and your story. Like, how do you show up to your story? Might be the most heroic question in that space.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that turns to so you see the bidirectional of this. It's like towards yourself in your own story, but then also towards other people. Right.
The
That's
being
interesting.
yourself, because where you're going to show up as the heroic figure is not going to be where someone else does.
Yeah.
And again, it's like never downplaying the people who showed up for me I didn't need people to come up and fight my battles for me. I'm pretty good at that part. But when someone was able to bring the softer side out of me,
Yeah.
that's someone I have a lot of respect for. And they've
Yeah.
done for me something that I had difficulty accessing within myself.
Yeah. When the archetypes are functioning in that higher way, that better way, is they have a quality of the sage to them, which is the ability to know when to use. Again, sage, right? Being wisdom. It's I know how to use my hero archetype inside me in this moment for this purpose. And I think when we're healthy, that sort of sage archetype is able to hold all of them and to recognize this is a moment for you to act as the hero, for yourself or for someone else, but in this particular way and not out of reaction.
Because ultimately, what a hero is, it's someone who is willing to take responsibility in the face of hardship. Whatever that
Mm-hmm.
responsibility looks like, whatever that hardship looks like, because what they've learned and they know, and this is like the every hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell would talk about, is those trials will transform them. Right? A lot of people have the desire to show up as the hero, but it's not until you go through the trials that you experience the transformation that you're actually standing in that archetype in its fullness as you are.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's to me what a hero is. It's someone who takes responsibility in the face of hardship.
Mm-hmm.
They're willing to do that. They're willing to stand up to the dragons and the demons and the self-deceptions and all of that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
All
Mm-hmm.
of
Yeah.
it is part of that.
Yeah, and they're also increasing in their agency rather than decreasing in their agency.
Huge. Because as we go and talk about the victim mentality, that's the very thing that they're lacking. And when people talk about this, um, the hero victim villain being a cycle, this is what they mean, is that you want to show up to hardship and you want to do the right thing, and you want to bring your gift to a situation, and you want to save the day, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't work out. There's a failure, there's a frustration, there's things get in the way. And a lot of times what happens, especially if we don't have voices that can assure us in that place, the guides, which we'll talk about later, we end up in this cycle where we do move more into the victim uh, mentality, the victim archetype, or that identity, even temporarily. And if I was to define what I think a victim is, it's one who feels out of control in a situation. Therefore, the defense is to control the narrative about the situation, right? When people talk about a victim mentality, people are telling a story that they didn't have any agency, that you were just talking about with the hero,
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
life is happening to me. I can't help it. There's nothing I
Yeah.
can do. It's just chaos. Other people are doing wrong and getting away with it. I'm doing the right thing and I'm not getting what I deserve. I feel out of control in the situation. So
Hmm.
my defense is to control the narrative. So this mentality is one of blaming others in order to excuse the self.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I was to put it in one sentence, I'd say it's that. It's putting the responsibility out there, blaming others to excuse the self.
Yeah. Yeah. The hero might use control, which isn't really agency. Agency means you're aware of your need for control and you're making, let's say, progress in moving out of that need for control in order to be on top of things and not be affected by life. So that's different than agency. Agency is that true freedom, internal freedom, in using their gifts. You think of the three assertive types, 3, 7s, and 8s. We're using our agenda, the
Yeah.
at stance, to move things, to make things happen, because we're uncomfortable with something, right? So this is why I don't think you can separate these archetypes. I think when you deny the victim inside you as a hero, you're also not really living fully into the hero archetype. You have more of that flavor to you, but you're not living fully into it, because now you're in control rather than, whereas you came up with the 3 C's: control, cajole, and convince. That's right. So the 3 C's, right? So you're in one of those when you're in the hero mode as a 3, 7, or 8. When you're in the victim mode, I love the way you put that with, you are controlling the narrative because you don't feel like you can control the circumstances around you. And I loved my narrative when I got booted out of a church. I got fired.
Me
Boy, did
too.
I have the most amazing narrative you could ever hear. And whether you
Oh,
liked it
me
or not,
too.
I might share it at you. I didn't want to be interrupted because I had a great narrative and it had an arc to it and had a beginning and an end and a great conclusion. But whenever someone poked at it, I would get I get super defensive.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's
No, I was in the exact same situation, like after I was fired, and I was telling the story and people felt bad for me, and it was like a little
yeah.
bit of a balm on it, and it was
Yeah.
right in that space that this guy came to me, and he kind of just shrugged. He's like, any interpretation of a situation that doesn't include our contribution is incomplete.
Oh,
And I was just
ouch.
like, oh, it just stabbed me right in the heart because I
Yeah.
wanted to be able to hold on to this narrative.
Mhm.
Because I could, and looking back now, I can feel myself trying to control that narrative,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because I couldn't control the situation.
Yeah.
That is my phrase that I came up with because I've done it, right? Like
Oh
that's the way
man.
I've done it. And I knew when he said that, like, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And it was convenient. But what was I doing? I was doing exactly what the behaviors of the victim mentality, because I still have agency, right, in this situation. I still was able to do things, but I was
Mhm.
avoiding responsibility, wasn't taking any of my contribution into play. I was blaming others, right? I had to make someone else a villain, right? That's part of it. So I could excuse myself, and I'm not in ownership because I'm in reaction. It's like I'm in
Yeah.
reaction
Yeah.
and non-ownership. Like that's what I was doing.
Yeah. It's so important to understand this inner agency instead of just external, because in some cases, like in yours and in mine, we didn't have agency. We got canned. I
Right.
mean, that's it. You're gone.
Yeah.
You don't have any power.
Right.
I tried to use everything. I definitely tried to use convincing. And it didn't work. In the end, I was gone, and it was like, that's the end of it. And so you feel completely lost of everything. In that case, being in a church and being on staff, it's like I lost everything. I lost my community, I lost my job, and in some sense, I lost my connection to spirituality. So it's a tough thing to experience that, and you don't have agency over the situation. I'm careful to say that because for those involved in social justice, those involved in helping those who do not have as much agency, hats off to you. I've been involved in those works,
Yeah.
deeply involved in social justice works. So I'm very familiar with that space. And, this is not about like, you should take agency and blame you for not having actual agency in the sense of external. Sometimes you don't.
Right.
Sometimes you don't. And that's really hard. But we're talking about more of that inner agency over how you respond, as you were saying earlier. It's how we respond to the situation that then is where you gain a truer freedom internally. And what I'm noticing now in a few areas that you and I are, connected to in terms of some stuff that's happening in a denomination we're a part of, it's like there's a lot of like, yeah, you genuinely victimized, like horrible
Hmm.
stuff, man,
Yeah.
horrible stuff. But there's also lots of narratives where there's also not really taken agency over our own responses. We know that, and I know that because I've done the same a lot over the course of my life. So
Yeah.
I
Well,
recognize it.
we were talking about what the hero is. It's because they are transformed by pain, right?
Yes, yes.
That's the whole point. So, yes, we went through this situation, but it was once I started owning the responsibility, it was once I started looking at what I actually have agency over, and I started taking steps to um not try to control the narrative, but to take the actions that I could. That's when I started to become transformed, which is
Hmm.
that's what the hero is supposed to do, right? They're going
Hmm.
to go
Yes.
through everything the victim goes through.
Yes. Very good. Very
But
good.
this is the
Yeah.
we'll get to more of this at the end, the solution, but this is the Richard Rohr thing. If you aren't
That's right.
transformed by your pain, you will
Yeah.
transmit your pain. So if you go through this pain, if you are transformed by it, that's the hero's journey. If you transmit it, that's the villain's journey.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's turn the corner to the villain. Like let's define what the villain is.
Yeah.
Which this is the part of us when we're telling these stories and we're talking about the normal life pains that we experience where we become something, the part of the everyday villain, it's the part of us that needs to justify the methods we use to get the outcomes we desire. So this may mean manipulating or controlling others to set the world right as we see it, right? I'll put that in quotes. But um, usually the villain is someone who sees themselves as the victim in order to see their villainous solution as a form of justice. It's the thing that is in all of us. It's the need to justify the methods we use to get the outcomes we desire because it wants to regain control that we've lost.
Hmm.
It even justifies harmful behavior as a way to make things right because it's like the ends justifies the means, right? I have to
Hmm.
fight fire
Hmm.
with fire. I've got to look out for myself. I've done this one a lot, right? I have to harden up to do whatever it takes. And I've definitely used either manipulation or control feels necessary to get needs met.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it- so all of those I think come into play. But when I look at like the everyday villain, that's how I see that archetype.
You have a real love and understanding of stories told in film. Those places where it seems like it's pretty constant in these superhero stories where they confront the villain and they have a conversation, and there's a few components here, but one of them is it's not rare that the villain will say, "You and I," speaking to the hero, "are not unalike," or "You and I are alike." And it's curious to me because there is something to that. And I'm wondering, what comes up for you as you think about that part of the story, because in one sense, the villain is going, I see injustice and I'm no longer following the rules, the societal ethics or rules. I've gone against them. And that's what makes me the villain.
Yeah.
However, you're using the rules and the societal ethics and all that. But at the core, you still got that something going on internally. I don't know, maybe the villain inside you as well. So I'm curious what you make of that. If that's a
Yeah. I think it's Donald Miller who says that, the hero and the villain, their backstory is the same. They both have the backstory of pain, but one uses it to become something else, and one is used by it to perpetuate pain. I think my favorite one in all of film, when you're talking about that conversation between usually the hero and the villain, is in The Dark Knight with the
So love
Joker.
that scene. Yes,
So it's near the end of the film. The hero, Batman, is talking to the villain, Joker, and Joker is put bombs on 2 boats, and he's put the triggers for each of those boats on the opposites. And all they have to do to save themselves is blow up the other boat. That's the context that he puts them in. And he says he's doing it in order to prove that when people are made the victim, the people in each boat, these groups, they're both victims. They're put in a situation of pain. And I think one boat is even full of convicts who are prisoners. And he's trying to make the point and prove to Batman that if you make people the victim, they will become the villain. And they will push the button, they will blow up the other boat to save themselves.
Yeah.
And there's the scenes in each of the boats where they're discussing this. And in the boat with the convicts, that one of the convicts walks up and he takes the button. He says, "You don't know what it takes to take a life. You don't know what it means."
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
So so give it to me because I know what it takes. And he takes the button and he throws it out the window into the water. So that they are not able to.
They can't do it. Yeah.
And everyone gets mad at him. They're like, "You've condemned us." But Batman is able to prove, he says, "See, that guy in that situation, he actually became the hero."
Yeah. So good.
That's the narrative that we're discussing is right in that scene.
Yeah.
And Batman says, "See, I proved to you that people can be good in these situations."
Yeah.
Even when being made the victim, that you put them in the situation.
Goes back to the transforming the pain, right? That's the
transforming it.
Yeah. And we have opportunities and moments to do that throughout our lives to really transform that. And that's really good. Yeah, now I'm not sure I want to bring in the positive side of the villain.
Well, no, it's not. It's so
because that's such a good story. Yeah.
But sometimes things get so convoluted that you need. See, here's the thing: is I don't know if it's the positive side of the villain. I think the trickster is something else. I think they're like the dark hero.
Yeah.
So you have an interesting take on the whole thing around the trickster in stories. And I think it's worth kind of taking a look at. I know we're saying we're not looking at every archetype in the world, but the trickster is this character that at times shows up as the villain.
Yeah.
And at times is the hero.
Yeah, just like the Joker. The Joker is, I think, a combination of trickster and villain.
Yeah.
But
Loki,
I think
Loki's an example of the trickster villain.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But that's where I think you have the redemptive part, and I'll tie this into the trickster, but the redemptive part to me, of the villain is the capability of going against all of those things, all the social norms, the rules, and to be willing to be seen as the villain. And this is where the villain hero kind of blend, right? It's like, I know that I have to go against all of this stuff and be hated and be rejected, and be misunderstood because I have to make things right. And because of the trickster's lack of loyalty to any of these systems,
Mm.
at their worst, they're only loyal to themselves and their appetites. Right? And so that's the reason why they're often hated and they're portrayed as the character nobody wants to be in film. Loki's that's you don't want to be around that. Slimy. It's you can't trust. You don't know which camp, right? And I think when it's neatly divided versus like you've got the good guys, the bad guys, you've got you got your clear heroes, and I want to talk about that, by the way, in terms of organizations, because I think they function very much in that, religious and political organizations, and then the people they serve. But you have this sort of like, here's the good guys, here's the hero who champions the good people, and then there's the victims, and they're the ones that are being taken care of by the hero. So you get your victim, you've got your heroes, and then you've got the opponent. And there always has to be an opponent for any good story. Right. The two forces. But then there's the trickster figure who's loyal to neither. And the trickster figure is the one that's going, I'm calling you all out on your like you're lying to each other, you're lying to the people. Some of you who really believe, unless you're a sociopath and you know what you're doing, the rest of you somewhat deceived by your own sanctimonious,
Right.
storytelling.
Maybe this will help as far as a framing goes, where I think the trickster is one who takes on the role of the villain for good when the power structure is flipped.
100%.
For instance,
yeah.
I think one of the most famous in history and greatest ones that I loved growing up is Robin Hood, right?
Oh,
So
yeah, great story. Yes.
So you have the spiritual and the political, they have the power, the structure at the top, and it's being used for evil. Therefore, the hero becomes the outlaw, and the trickster. Zorro is as another example of that same kind of thing, like becomes this thing in order to upset the system as is. So it's still a heroic figure, but it's almost well, we're talking about there's archetypes here, but there's also like what the archetype tends to look like, and it's shifting the perceptions of what that looks like. Which is why I think when it comes to so much of the archetypes, we're trying to be honest with our own story and how we are seeing ourselves. Because I mean, Robin Hood clearly sees himself as the hero, but the powers that be clearly see him as the villain.
The villain,
right?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, in the Christian world, that Jesus himself is a trickster figure, and I'm not sure people like that so much, but it's like, well, think about that. I mean, by the definition of a trickster, it's like someone who's loyal to no system. And that's enormously frustrating to people who wanted you have to fit in. The hardest thing is not to fit into one of these systems, because nobody likes to be ostracized. Right. That's a social imperative that lies deep within all of us as humans. Social rejection is the same thing as death. Because he's willing to do that, you're right. In that sense, the Romans see him as the enemy. The religious leaders see him as the enemy. See him as the villain, and then the people that are being helped see him as the hero. Right? So it is more, it's more nuanced when you put it in that way, in that framing. So, yeah.
But let's come back to this idea that it's around like how we see ourselves, because I think what we're talking about now really reveals the narrative and the perspective, right? So you take Star Wars, the Empire sees the rebels as the outlaws and see themselves as law and order, and the rebels see them as this oppressive overlord that they have to fight against. And we as the audience are taken into one of those narratives. Like clearly, the Empire is evil. And of course it is, because it's, they're blowing up worlds and stuff. So sure. but the point is, what do we see in ourselves? Can we see this cycle in ourselves of us being wanting to be the hero, having the desire, having things fall apart, living into an opposite narrative, being willing to justify our actions in order to regain a sense of autonomy, control, any say so in our lives? Do we see ourselves going through that cycle?
Yeah.
And can we see ourselves honestly when we're showing up as one of those things?
Yeah. By the way, that ends up causing all sorts of problems. It's not just about navel gazing and looking internally to say, yeah, which one am I? And it's like endlessly sort of self-gazing. It's about the wisdom of recognizing how much I've given my agency at times to others, how much I've given my agency to an organization, to something to save me from something I don't want to deal with. How much have I scapegoated stuff where I'm angry about something that's happening in my relationship with my wife, but I'm taking it out in other areas, right? Other things become the focus of my anger. And I think that is a constant within this. And this is the reason why I think scapegoat is important as part of understanding how these three archetypes work, because the hero, if they're not the healthy version of a hero, but they're the hero that seeks power and control over a system and organization, they're all too eager to give you a scapegoat. And they're all too eager to win you over as a victim. In the areas where you have been victimized, in the areas where you feel you lack agency, they're all too happy to sell you agency, or a perceived sense of agency. And that's the thing where I think, man, we got to wake up to this stuff, or we're not changing the world around us. Because how you change the world is you change the world by true agency. I'm convinced of that. And if we have that, we have the wisdom to know how to regain that internal agency, then we are becoming transformative in our approach in the world. And the transformative power that we're living into, others begin to recognize that they can do this too. And they begin to live taking agency over their own lives. And in that way, we don't transmit the pain. Because here's the problem, is that the oppressed become the oppressor. This is a consistent narrative throughout literature. All of literature, all of history, I should say. If you look at history, it is continuous that the people that are oppressed, eventually when they get into positions of power, they oppress others. And they believe that they're right. And that's the reason why we're having this conversation of, like, the empire believes they're right. The rebels, we're drawn into the story to see the rebels as the true. But the thing is, if the rebel doesn't actually transform their own pain, when they get power, they become the oppressor.
Right. Well, that's all over the Star Wars saga, right? So then it
yeah,
becomes the Republic and the Senate, and then they are having
right,
power over others,
yeah,
and I don't mean it to sound that pessimistic, but it's ultimately I want to have the awareness when I'm doing this. And something you said a second ago reminded me of an aspect of the villain you didn't mention, which is people making themselves the villain in the way they tell their stories.
oh yeah,
So I've ruined my life. I'm a terrible person.
that's right.
I've just
Yeah,
made terrible decisions. I'm my own worst enemy. So that's a little thing to look at. Are you talking to yourself as the villain? Accusing yourself of being the villain. Like that's one that I don't
yep.
really relate to, so I almost forgot, but something you said a second ago reminded me of that.
Oh, I've done that. There've been times where it's like, okay, I'll take the responsibility. I've
But
heard
it doesn't
people say
sound
this.
like
I take the responsibility.
responsibility. It sounds like
No, it's not. But we're not taking. I'm
yeah,
not saying.
okay, okay.
I'm not taking responsibility. I'm saying I'm taking responsibility, which what I'm doing is taking blame.
Got it.
And there's a big difference between taking blame and taking responsibility. That's for sure. But that's what I was doing, and relate to that and see other people do that too, where it's, I take responsibility. I was the one, and then they become essentially a scapegoat for the organization. But yeah, I'm it's not my go-to, but I've gone there.
Yeah.
When everything else seems to have stopped working.
Yeah. And in this framework, if you want to know we're too quick to call people narcissists, but if you want to talk about like what the narcissist voice sounds like, which can show up for anyone in some of these situations, is where they act like a villain and speak like a victim.
Mm.
That's what a
Ooh.
narcissist is. They act like the villain, justifying behavior,
Yeah.
but they speak like a victim. This happened to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mentioned before this cycle, right? So
Yeah.
we often are trying to be the hero. When it fails in some way, we take on the role of the victim who, couldn't make things work. Then in order to regain a sense of control, we justify being the villain in order to, make things right, quote unquote. So the villain needs to see themselves as the victim in order to see their villainous solution as a form of justice. So that's the cycle.
Yeah.
Now, I think
Makes sense.
anyone, when we talk about the hero's journey and why that framework from Joseph Campbell shows up in so many stories, why it resonates, and that that person doesn't become the villain in that story because of the guide. So
Okay.
the reason that the hero can go through the hero's journey is because they have the mentor. Without the
Yeah.
voices, the wise voices in your life, without mentoring presences, I think we go through the cycle. But like
Mm.
I said in that story when I was earlier, when I was in that situation where I was telling the story from a victim perspective and someone called me out. I
Yeah.
actually just had this recently happen in jujitsu where I interpreted someone's behavior towards me as villainous, but a wise voice helped me reinterpret the experience because I asked someone. Had I not
Mm.
asked, I would have told a different story. I would have seen myself
Yeah.
as the victim in the situation, and I might have responded to that person in a villainous way to set things right.
Yeah.
So it's the voice of the mentor, I think, that keeps us out of the cycle.
Yeah. Well, that's wisdom, right? So back to wisdom.
Back to wisdom.
Wisdom. Yeah. Wisdom is that figure. It's that voice that calls out to us that says, pay attention, listen to me, and we can so easily ignore that voice. By the way, a mentor isn't a single figure, right, Jim? Because this is what gets, we can get really
We'll
confused by
get
that.
to
Well, I don't have
this
a mentor
when
in my
we
life.
talk about the wisdom of community.
That's right. That's right. That's community becomes that. So it's looking for the archetype. It's looking for that voice of wisdom, that mentor, and it shows up in odd places. And this buddy of mine isn't one that I would say is a mentor, but
But in a
had a
moment,
in a moment,
listening for
even
it,
a
if you're
that's right.
tuned, if your ears are tuned for that wisdom voice, you'll
Yes,
find it
yes.
everywhere.
You'll find it everywhere. That's right. That's right. That's right. It's all about very much about that. Life is the teacher, but are you a student? Are you listening? That was a profound moment of, hey, you're trying to change people and they don't want to be changed. So now who's the jerk? And I was like, oh, damn, that one stung because it was, oh, right, I'm telling the story of I'm the victim here because I'm doing all this work trying to help people to change. They don't want to change, and he's saying to me, well, if they don't want to change, they don't want to change. Why are you trying to force them into that? And who's the jerk by doing that? And it was like, okay, that shifted the story
Yeah.
significantly to then I could show a lot more. Once again, the attention goes back to in what way have I given this agency, or maybe never reclaim? Maybe it's just never was with me, and it's my opportunity to claim more agency in my life, and so yeah, internal agency. It was like, you know what? I'm trying to change these people, but what's really going on for me internally that I'm not satisfied with that? Is that a need for feeling important, feeling like my words have value, my thoughts have value and people respect my thoughts and like, is that what's going on here? In which case, then that's again back to the agency that we have internal. So I'm just modeling this for us as walk through the process of when that happens, when that painful voice returns. By the way, any good sage, any good mentor is an annoying figure. It's not, almost no one is like, oh, the mentor is just so sweet, so nurturing, just a, you know,
Well, they challenge, right? That's their whole role is they're actually providing a enormous amount of challenge. And I think when it comes to the solution, what the hero's journey is, what they become, largely because of the mentor voices and the circumstances they go through. It has to do with two areas that they're helped along the way with, which is their relationship to their agency and their response to pain. Those are the two things. We mentioned this before, like the hero and the villain, they both have the same background of pain,
Yeah.
but their response to it due to their relationship with their own agency is what makes them someone different.
Yeah.
For all of us, I think this is what it comes down to. It's our relationship to pain. This is why I quoted Richard Rohr before. If you are not transformed by your pain, you will transmit it. So if you do not become the hero, you will either become the victim or the villain. Like that's I think the same Batman movie where he says you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's the Two-Face character, which is what happens to that
Yeah. Yeah.
character
Yeah. Yeah.
based on his own perspective. But that's the whole thing. It's like, what do we do with pain? There's so
Yeah.
much about even the way I've told my story. I've sometimes told my story in a way to avoid pain.
Yeah. Isn't that funny how it is? It's like we're rehearsing a painful event, but we're doing it as a means to not feel that pain again. Um,
Well, this is what I said
yeah.
at the beginning. It's not the experience, it's the interpretation and story we tell
Yeah.
about the experience.
Well, I guess it's not that surprising because what we are doing is in fact trying to tell the story as a means of saying someone else is the cause of our pain.
Mhm.
Um, Let me just jump back to something just about 15 seconds ago. The Schmiegel character, it's an interesting one. Troubled me a
Oh,
lot because there's a moment, I mean, it really troubled me because I was like rooting for him. I forget his name prior to
the
Schmiegel.
Schmiegal was his Hobbit name before he became Gollum.
That's it. Okay, so that's right, Schmiegel to Gollum. But oh man, I was rooting for him when he's Schmiegel, and I feel bad for him. Want him to, you see moments of innocence, you see moments of even hope, and it gets dashed. And boy, that just broke my heart. And it's like, damn, if that's not real life for so many of us who go through those pure moments of innocence where you're starting to hope that maybe you could be in relationship, maybe you could have a meaningful life, maybe you could contribute something to the world that's that the world receives, and it doesn't, and it backfires, and so I think that's such a great contrast to my mind of that what you were describing earlier of the victim to the villain kind of
Mm.
movement.
Yeah, it's interesting when they go back and they look at Schmiegal's story and the decisions he made that turned him into Gollum.
Yeah.
It made me think of Abby and I have talked about when she worked at a retirement center for a long time, one for about 7.5 years, that when you meet a lot of older people, they have tended to go in one of two directions. They've either become
Mm.
more kind of dogmatic and rigid and, bitter, crotchety, like some of those stereotypes, or they've become very like sweet and
Yeah.
empathetic and open and, oh, darling, the
Yeah.
understanding
Yeah.
because it's over time. And I understand there was those scenes where like, it's almost Smeagol and Gollum arguing with himself, like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the
Right. Right. Right.
versions
Yeah.
of, like,
Yeah.
it's almost like, could he go in this other
Could he
direction?
go in that direction? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I had such a different reaction when, Gandalf says, like, "Don't hurt him. I think he still has a part to play." And I'm like, "No,
Mm.
no. It's too much of a threat. You gotta
Neutralize the threat.
neutralize the
Yeah.
threat."
Yeah.
That's how I felt.
Yeah.
But at
Yeah.
the end, Frodo is going to become the villain because he doesn't want to throw the ring in the fires of Mordor and he's turning around to walk away. and it's Gollum that comes out and takes the ring and ends up falling into the fire,
Mm,
because they're struggling with it. And so if
mhm,
Gollum
mhm.
hadn't done that, like,
Yeah,
Frodo would have become the next Gollum. Like, that's
yeah,
where
that
it
crazy.
is.
That's crazy.
And so there
Wow.
it's just so much more nuanced and complicated, because
Yeah,
Frodo saw his whole journey of him going there. He was going there as the hero to
yeah, yeah,
save Middle Earth.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It is. Whew, yeah. I mean, that one touches me deeply. It's
Mhm.
like this is the story of our lives. This is the paths that so many of us have taken, and for us to not to be harsh on ourselves. That there are moments and periods and seasons even of our lives where we end up more in that role of being an angry victim, and telling our stories because of the pain. And all grace to you, absolutely nothing but grace, because it's in that space of gentleness and kindness to ourselves that we can emerge and find our return to that a place of agency over our lives. But it's also important to be aware of how, if we do not recognize the ways we've been victimized, the areas where we have been affected by life. Life does affect us. We get hurt. Things happen to us all the time. I'm not talking about when you're a child alone. I'm talking about, you have a car accident. You weren't expecting that to happen. Now, certainly there are all kinds of factors you can look at it. I was too tired. I wasn't paying attention. My phone dropped on the floor and I tried to reach it. There's all sorts of things like that that can come up. But there are times where there is pure accident. You couldn't have done anything about it. It happens to you. And we are affected by that. Someone says something that hurts us, that's harsh. Some incident we didn't expect. There's
Yeah.
so many things that affect us day to day. The weather affects
Yeah.
us.
We get
All
fired. The spouse leaves, and one person's wondering why. They don't understand.
Yeah,
Like, all of these things. Yeah.
we are affected. And I think that's one of the things that the victim teaches us is you have been affected by life, and don't deny that. And I think that's a wonderful truth. And when we make peace with that and we begin to allow that awareness to come in, the wisdom to come in of, but how am I responding to that? Right? I can respond by entering more fully into the victim and becoming, having that victim mindset. Or I can flip it and go all hero and deny that it's happened in me and just kind of try to fix everybody else. Or I have a different option. I can allow the pain to do its work inside me, to be kind and to be gracious to it. And then as it does its work, it will transform you. And then you'll notice that, oh, you'll have ahas like, oh, yeah, I know I was predisposed to being hurt this way now. I can see it. I can see how I was actually acting blind. I wasn't truly fully blind. I mean, there were places where I was. Some cases it's like complete victim. There was nothing you could do. But in other areas, you can start to see where there is like, yeah, I did see how I looked away. Um, and and I also realized my own predispositions to being pulled by even by type, being pulled into a direction. And so that's a way to then you begin to reclaim your agency. And in that way, we aren't being duped by the very unhealthy heroic figures and institutions, um, that are always wanting to sell something to us for those of us who want that quick fix, who want to be saved. And that to me is why it's so important for us to understand this. Otherwise, we're constantly going to be fooled. We're constantly going to be pulled in. We're going to be, it's like the definition of bullshit, I think, is that you know and they know, but you're still buying into it. It's the beer commercial where it's like, no, that you're not going to walk into a bar with a bunch of beautiful human beings that are all having a great time, the time of their lives. That's not going to happen, but yet you bullshit yourself into buying that. And I think That's the thing. And we go to religious institutions and we find ourselves wanting to be saved by the leaders and by the organization so that we don't have to face that. And I think good spirituality, good wisdom says, no, you got to confront the pain and make peace with it and welcome it and allow it to do its work inside you. So yeah.
That's it. Let it do its work inside you, which takes us essentially back to what we said at the very beginning, which is it's the interpretation and response to a circumstance that holds more power than the circumstance itself.
Absolutely.
And when we go through that process, we are becoming the hero. We're not waiting for them.
Yeah.
We're becoming.
Yeah. The hero of your own life. Yes. And that's the beautiful integration where it's like, oh yeah, I know the victim inside me. Oh yeah, I know the hero inside me. And I know the villain inside me, and I know the trickster inside me, and yeah, all these parts, they have a role to play inside me. But yeah, I think that's fantastic.
Good.